Perch 9 turned slowly against the dark, a ring of grey hub modules wrapped around a mining core the size of a small moon. Out here, past the last charted trade lane of the Kestrel Concord, there was no sunrise and no sunset, only the station's own lighting cycle pretending at both, dimming and brightening on a schedule someone had set decades ago and never bothered to update. Mara Ilic worked third shift on the ore processes, which meant she worked mostly alone, in corridors lit low and quiet, with only the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional clank of settling metal for company. She liked it that way. Third shift asked fewer questions. At 2 in the morning by the station clock, she knelt beside a Concord-built filtration unit that was not, officially, hers to open, and pulled the access panel free with the practiced ease of someone who had done this exact motion hundreds of times before. The unit had been installed 11 years ago, back when Perch 9 first came online under Concord license, back when Mara was still a child riding her father's shoulders through half-finished corridors that smelled of fresh sealant. Its coolant valves were designed for a species called the Doran, whose body temperature ran several degrees warmer than a human's, and whose engineers had built every piece of standard Concord equipment around Doran tolerances without a second thought for anyone else who might one day have to keep it running. Mara had learned, through months of quiet trial and error, patient evenings spent alone with a test rig and more failed attempts than she liked to count, that if she reground the valve seats by half a degree of angle, the unit ran 20% cooler and lasted twice as long between failures. Nobody had taught her that fact from a manual. Nobody could have. The Concord manual for this unit did not acknowledge that a colder tolerance was even possible, because the engineers who wrote it had never needed to imagine a technician built differently from themselves. She was not supposed to know any of this. She was certainly not supposed to act on it. Human technicians on Perch 9 were licensed only to clean, restock, and report faults. Repairs belonged to certified Concord engineers, who visited once every few months on a supply run and rarely stayed long enough to notice a valve seat ground half a degree off spec, buried under 3 layers of housing that nobody outside the maintenance crew ever opened. Mara worked fast and quiet, the way she always did, her hands moving through the sequence from memory, feeling for the small resistance that told her the seat had settled correctly. When she was done, she wiped her tools clean, sealed the panel, and logged the unit as nominal, exactly as the manual required, no more and no less. Then she caught the eye of a small maintenance drone hovering near the corridor junction, and for one instant her stomach dropped before her mind caught up with her body. The drone was not a Concord inspection unit. It was old, one of the station's own, patched together from spare parts, with no authority to report anything to anyone. Still, she made a habit of checking. Habits like that had kept people like her employed for 11 years, and she was not about to break the habit tonight of all nights. She finished her shift without incident, moving through 3 more units on her list, touching only the 2 she had already reworked months ago, leaving the rest exactly as regulation demanded. On her way back to the residential ring, she passed the long observation window that looked out over the mining core, vayrite or glowing faint blue in the rock far below, threaded through the stone like something alive, worth more per ton than the entire human colony that dug it out ever saw in wages across a lifetime. A voice crackled over the corridor speaker, flat and translated by the station's language system into careful, toneless English, the kind of voice that always sounded like it was reading from a form. All personnel, notice. Concord Inspectorate vessel inbound. Estimated arrival, 6 hours. Prepare for full compliance review. Mara stopped walking. A compliance review meant someone was coming to check whether Perch 9 was following every rule exactly as written, down to the smallest bolt. She thought about the valve seats, and about a dozen other small, careful, unauthorized fixes scattered across the station like seeds she had been planting for years, each one small enough to go unnoticed, all of them together forming a pattern she had never once stopped to add up. 6 hours was not very much time to decide whether any of it would hold up to a closer look. She did not go straight to her bunk. Instead, she took the long way through the residential ring, past rows of sleeping quarters stacked 3 high, past the small hydroponics garden someone had planted years ago in a corridor never meant for growing things, tomato vines climbing a trellis built from scrap piping. Her grandmother had helped plant that garden, back when Perch 9 was new and everyone still called it the rig instead of the station, back before anyone had settled into the idea that this cold, humming ring of metal might actually become someone's home. Mara paused at the garden for a moment, breathing in the faint green smell of it, the only living smell on the entire station besides the recycled air of the residential decks themselves. She thought about her grandmother's hands, thick-knuckled from decades of station work, and about the stories she used to tell of the very first Concord inspection, back when nobody knew yet whether humans would be allowed to stay at all. "We passed that one too," Her grandmother used to say, "We always pass. We just don't always like what passing costs us." Mara had never fully understood what that meant until tonight. Perch 9 housed just under 4,000 humans, most of them descended from the original contract colonists who had signed on 2 generations ago, back when Earth was still negotiating its very first trade terms with the wider galaxy, back when nobody on the planet fully understood what they were agreeing to. The Kestrel Concord was not an empire, and its officials were quick to remind anyone who suggested otherwise. It was closer to a trade confederation, dozens of member species bound together by shared shipping lanes, shared currency, and a long, dense list of shared regulations that nobody outside the Concord's own bureaucracy fully understood, least of all the humans who lived under it. Humanity was not a member. Humanity was a licensed labor contractor, one tier above raw contract workers and several tiers below anyone who ever got a seat at a negotiating table. That was the arrangement Director Priya Nandan had signed on behalf of Earth's government, back when Earth had almost nothing else to offer and needed somewhere to put people who wanted a future among the stars, however small a future it turned out to be. Priya ran the human side of Perch 9 out of a cramped office 2 decks above the processing floor, its walls lined with old paper printouts nobody had bothered to digitize, a habit she had never quite broken. She had grey in her hair now and a permanent line between her eyebrows that Mara suspected would never fully go away, not even on the good days. 6 hours, Priya said, when Mara found her already awake, already scrolling through incoming Concord traffic on her console, a mug of cold tea forgotten at her elbow. Full compliance review. That's not routine. Do they say why? They never say why. Priya rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. Last full review was 4 years ago. We passed clean. Nothing's changed since then that I know of. Mara did not mention the valve seats. She had never mentioned the valve seats to Priya, not because she didn't trust her, but because the fewer people who knew the exact scope of it, the fewer people could be blamed if it ever went wrong. It was a kind of quiet protection she offered without being asked, the same way her mother had once kept certain worries to herself rather than pass them along. The old man who had taught her how to do it had never told anyone either, not for 30 years running. Sam Okafor had come to Perch 9 as a boy on one of the earliest contract ships, back when the station was barely more than a mining rig with bunks bolted to it and half its corridors still open to vacuum behind temporary seals. He was retired now, technically, drawing a modest pension the Concord begrudged every quarter, though he still spent most days in the machine shop teaching younger technicians things the Concord manuals never mentioned and never would. Mara found him there an hour after the announcement, already elbow-deep in a spare filtration unit, as if he had somehow known she would come looking before she knew it herself. "You heard," he said, without looking up from his work. 6 hours. Sam set down his tool, wiped his hands on a rag gone grey with age, and finally met her eyes. "You touched the valve seats on Unit 4 again? Recently, I mean." Mara hesitated, then nodded. There was no point lying to him. He had taught her the technique in the first place, years ago, in this same shop, late at night, the same way his own mentor had taught him, a chain of quiet lessons stretching back further than either of them fully knew. How many units, total, across the station? Best guess. Everything you've touched, everything I've touched, everyone we've ever shown. Mara did the math in her head, running through processing floor, life support, the smaller units tucked into residential blocks. 60, maybe 70, if you count the ones from before I started. Sam exhaled slowly, a long breath through his nose, and for a moment he looked older than Mara had ever seen him. "That's more than I thought. A lot more." "Is that bad?" "Depends what they're actually looking for." He wiped grease from his hands with the same rag, a gesture more habit than function at this point. Concord inspectors aren't stupid, Mara. Slow to notice things, maybe, careful in ways that can look like blindness from the outside. Not stupid. If they pull maintenance logs and cross-reference part where against installation dates, someone is going to ask why our equipment has been lasting twice as long as the spec sheets say it should. And once they ask, they won't stop asking until they get an answer. Then we tell them the truth. We fixed it. We made it better. That should count for something. Sam looked at her then, and there was something old and careful in his expression, the look of a man who had lived through more of these reviews than he liked to remember, who had watched good intentions get filed away as violations more times than he cared to count. "We are not licensed to fix anything," he said quietly. "Out here, being right and being permitted are 2 very different things. and it's the second one that gets written into the report. You'll want to remember that before this inspector arrives, because I promise you he won't forget it." Mara sat down on an overturned crate across from him, the same crate she had sat on as a girl, watching him work long before he ever let her hold a tool herself. "You could have stopped teaching this after the first suspension. Grace's suspension, I mean. Why keep going?" Sam considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly, turning it over before answering. Because the alternative was watching good equipment fail early and good people get blamed for it anyway. If a filtration unit breaks down because nobody serviced it properly, that gets logged as a maintenance failure. Hours. Always hours, no matter whose design was flawed to begin with. So either we let things break on schedule and take the blame quietly, or we fix them quietly and take a smaller risk instead. I chose the smaller risk. Grace chose it before me. I don't imagine either of us thought it would still be going 70 years later. And now it might be the reason they shut the whole station down. Might be, Sam agreed. Or it might be the reason they finally have to look at us differently. I don't know which yet, and I won't pretend to you that I do. But I know which one I'd rather leave behind for the next apprentice to find. Outside the machine shop, the corridor lights dimmed another notch, marking the station's version of deep night, and somewhere down the hall a child laughed at something, a small ordinary sound that made the whole conversation feel briefly, achingly fragile. The Kestrel Concord operated on an index. Every member species, every licensed contractor, every labor population fell somewhere on a scale from Tier 1, meaning fully sovereign and technologically self-sufficient, down through Tier 5, meaning newly contacted and considered too underdeveloped to be trusted with unsupervised technical work of any kind. Humanity sat at Tier 5. It had sat there since first contact, based on a single survey conducted by a junior Concord assessment team almost 80 years ago, back when Earth's most advanced ships still used chemical engines for atmospheric launch, and the very idea of a Concord trade lane sounded like fiction to most people watching the news at home. The survey measured one thing, and one thing only: how long it had taken humans, working entirely alone, to invent their own technology from first principles. By that measure, humans looked slow. It had taken 12,000 years to go from stone tools to spaceflight. Other species on the index had made that same journey in a fraction of the time, guided by circumstances of biology or geography that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with luck. Nobody on that assessment team had thought to measure a different question. How fast could humans learn something that already existed, once somebody simply showed it to them, once the years of trial and error were already done by someone else and all that remained was watching closely? Mara did not know the exact history of the index. Almost no human on Perch 9 did, beyond the vague understanding that the number attached to their species was low and unlikely to ever move. What she knew was simpler and more personal. Tier 5 status meant humans were licensed for labor only, never for design, never for repair, never for anything that required what the Concord called technical judgment, a phrase that always sounded, in translation, faintly like an insult dressed up as policy. Warden Ozil Vray, the Concord inspector who oversaw Perch 9's operating license, believed in the index the way some people believe in gravity, as a simple fact of the universe rather than an opinion someone once had and never revisited. Ozil was Doran, warm-blooded, feather-crested along the ridge of his skull in shades of dull bronze, standing a full head taller than most humans, with an unhurried way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a small, carefully considered verdict. "Your species," Ozil had told Priya once, years earlier, in a tone that was not unkind so much as entirely certain of itself, "is diligent. Diligence is valuable. I have never once accused your people of laziness, and I want that understood." He had left the rest unspoken, the way people do when they think the rest is obvious and requires no further explanation. Diligent, and nothing more. A compliment shaped exactly like a ceiling. Mara had heard that story from Priya more than once, always told the same way, in the same flat, careful voice. It was the kind of thing that stuck with a person, not because it was cruel, but because it was said so gently, and meant so completely, without a trace of doubt behind it. That night, while the station waited out its final hours before the review, corridors quieter than usual as word of the inspection spread, Sam pulled a data slate from a locked drawer in the machine shop and set it on the workbench between himself and Mara, its casing scratched and worn from decades of handling. "Something you should see," he said. "Before tomorrow, before any of this gets away from us." The slate held decades of personal logs, going back to Sam's own apprenticeship on Perch 9, back to a mentor of his own named Grace Adeyemi, one of the very first human technicians on the station, a woman Mara had only ever seen in old photographs. The early entries were simple, dated, and terse. A valve reground here. A coolant mix adjusted there. Small unauthorized improvements, made quietly, station by station, technician by technician, passed down like a family recipe instead of a filed engineering report, never once written up through official channels. How far back does this go? Mara asked, scrolling slowly, watching years compress under her thumb. Further than Perch 9, Sam said. Grace worked 3 different Concord stations before she ever landed here. She learned the trick on the very first one, from someone else whose name she never wrote down, and she brought it with her every time she moved. I don't know how many hands it's passed through by now, or how many stations are running a little smoother because of something none of them ever got credit for. Mara scrolled through years of entries, small fixes accumulating into something far larger than any single technician had ever intended, a quiet inheritance nobody outside their own community even knew existed. Why keep it a secret this whole time? If it works, why not just say so? Sam was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed somewhere past the workbench. Because the first time someone tried to report it properly, back when Grace was young and still believed the truth was enough on its own, the Concord engineer who reviewed the report wrote the technician up for an authorized modification and had her contract suspended for a full year. No pay, no work, nearly lost her housing over it. After that, people stopped reporting it. They just kept doing it quietly, because quietly, at least, it worked, and nobody got hurt for trying to be honest about it. What happened to Grace? After the suspension, I mean. She came back, Sam said, a faint smile touching his mouth for the first time that night. Worked another 30 years after that, trained a dozen apprentices, myself included. She used to say the Concord could suspend a contract, but it couldn't unteach a pair of hands. I think about that more than I probably should. He tapped the data slate once, gently, like closing a door on something private. She's been gone 11 years now. Died in her sleep in the same residential block she moved into the week Perch 9 opened. Never once left the station in her whole life out here, not for a single visit home. Mara had walked past that residential block 1,000 times without knowing whose door it had once been. It struck her, sitting there in the quiet machine shop, that the entire station was built on that kind of invisible history, small, unremarkable rooms that had once held enormous, unrecorded lives. I keep thinking about the where Patton Ozil flagged, she said. Unit 4. If he pulls every log the way Grace's engineer once did, he's not going to find one violation. He's going to find 70 years of them. I know, Sam said. That's what worries me most. Not tonight's review. What comes after it, if they start looking for a pattern instead of an incident? Mara did not sleep before the review. She spent the last hour walking the processing floor instead, her boots quiet on the metal grating, checking each unit she had touched over the years, running her hand along housings she knew better by feel than she knew most people's faces, more familiar to her fingers than her own reflection. At the far end of the floor, past rows of humming filtration equipment, a status board flickered in the low light, tracking the station's or output against its license quota, a number set by the Concord based on projections calculated years in advance and never once updated for actual conditions on the ground. She noticed something she had noticed before and never quite known what to do with. The quota had been rising steadily for 3 years, pushed higher each cycle by demand from somewhere far up the Concord supply chain, while the mining core's structural integrity readings had been quietly falling, a slow decline nobody outside the maintenance crews seemed to be tracking at all. She pulled up the readings on her own console, cross-referenced them the way Sam had taught her years ago, patient and methodical, and did the math twice to be sure she hadn't made an error somewhere in the chain. At the current quota, with the current integrity trend continuing unchanged, the core support lattice would reach critical stress in under 8 months, maybe sooner if extraction kept accelerating the way it had been. She flagged it in the station's internal maintenance log, carefully worded, technical, unremarkable, the way she had learned to phrase things that needed saying without drawing too much attention to who was saying them. She had flagged similar things before, smaller warnings that mostly went nowhere. Most flags like this waited weeks for a Concord engineer to even open them, and by the time one finally did, the note usually read as overly cautious, filed away without comment, unresolved and quietly forgotten. This one sat unread when the inspectorate vessel finally arrived, its arrival visible first as a bright point of light through the observation window, then as a long grey hull sliding into the station's largest docking bay with the kind of practiced precision that made every human worker nearby stop and watch. Warden Ozil Vray came aboard with 2 junior assessors trailing half a step behind him and a compliance drone that hovered at his shoulder like a small silent shadow, recording everything, missing nothing. He moved through Perch 9's corridors with the same unhurried certainty Mara remembered from Priya's old story, pausing at intervals to have the drone scan equipment, murmuring notes to his assessors in the Doran language that the station's translators rendered only partially, in disconnected fragments that never quite added up to a full sentence. He stopped at Unit 4 on the processing floor, the same filtration unit Mara had reground 2 nights before, and studied its readout for a long, silent moment, his crest feathers shifting slightly, a gesture Mara had learned over the years to read as focused attention rather than anything more alarming. "This unit's wear pattern is unusual," he said, to nobody in particular, though the whole floor seemed to hold its breath around him. "Lower than expected for its service age. Significantly lower." An assessor beside him made a note on a slate. Mara, standing a respectful distance away with her hands folded behind her back, exactly as Priya had once coached every technician to stand during an inspection, said nothing at all. Ozil turned his gaze toward her, unhurried, curious rather than accusing, though the distinction felt thin under the weight of his attention. "You service this unit?" "Yes, sir." "You have noticed the wear pattern?" Mara chose her words with the same care she used on the valve seats, small and precise and true as far as they went. "I've noticed it runs well, sir." Ozil studied her a moment longer, his expression unreadable, then moved on without further comment, and Mara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, her heart still hammering against her ribs. It was not an accusation. Not yet. But it was, she understood with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach, the beginning of a question that would not simply go away on its own. The tour continued for another hour, Ozil and his assessors moving methodically through the processing floor, the residential ring, the hydroponics corridor where Mara's grandmother's tomato vines still climbed their scrap metal trellis. At each stop, the compliance drone recorded readings that Mara suspected would eventually be laid side by side with maintenance logs going back years, a slow accumulation of small suspicious numbers that no single technician could explain away on her own. Priya walked beside Ozil for most of the tour, answering questions in the careful, measured tone she used only during reviews, a tone Mara had learned to recognize as the sound of a woman holding a great deal very still. At one point, passing the garden, Ozil paused and studied the tomato vines with what might have been curiosity. "This was not part of the original station design," he observed. "No," Priya said. "Someone planted it anyway, a long time ago. It grows food nobody counted on having, and it makes the corridor smell like something other than recycled air. We never filed a request to plant it. I suppose that's a violation too, if you're looking for one." Ozil considered the vines a moment longer, then moved on without answering, and Priya let out a breath very similar to the one Mara had let out at Unit 4, the particular relief of a question asked and, for now, left unpursued. The reactor cascade began 4 hours into the compliance review, and it began exactly where Mara's flag note had predicted it eventually would, though nobody expected it to happen quite this soon, and certainly not with an inspectorate vessel still docked and its warden still walking the halls. A support strut in the mining core, weakened by 3 years of quota-driven over-extraction, fractured under load with a groan that registered on sensors 2 decks away before anyone heard it directly. The fracture cascaded through the lattice faster than the station's automated systems could compensate, and within minutes Perch 9's primary reactor, drawing coolant from a feed line that ran directly through the compromised section, began registering a pressure spike that climbed steadily toward critical. Alarms lit the processing floor in pulsing red, a sound Mara had only ever heard during drills, never for real. Ozil and his assessors, still touring the residential ring on the far side of the station, were suddenly a full 10 minutes from the reactor control room, cut off by a service corridor now sealed automatically for safety, exactly as protocol demanded and exactly as bad luck would have it. Mara was 2 decks closer. She reached the control room at a dead run, lungs burning, and found 2 junior human technicians already there, pale-faced, staring at readouts climbing toward numbers none of them had ever seen outside a training simulation, their hands hovering uselessly over controls they weren't certified to touch. "Talk to me," she said, skidding to a stop beside the console. "Coolant feeds compromised. Pressures climbing fast. We can't reach Concord Engineering. They're locked out with the inspectorate on the other side of the seal, and dispatch isn't answering." One of the technicians, a young man named Deshi barely 2 years into his contract, was already reading numbers off the secondary display, his voice climbing toward panic. "Core temperatures rising in Section 3. If the strut goes further, We lose containment on the whole lattice, not just the feed line. We're looking at station-wide shutdown minimum, maybe worse. How much worse? Mara said, though she already suspected the answer. Worse as in evacuation protocols, worse. Worse as in some of the older residents in Block 6 don't make it to the shuttles in time, worse. Mara closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and made herself breathe. Panic would not help the coolant lines settle any faster, and neither would hesitation. She opened her eyes and looked at the schematic again, tracing the secondary feed with her finger the way she had traced 100 smaller versions of this exact problem on units a fraction of this size. Standard procedure called for a full reactor shutdown, which would take the station's power offline for weeks while a Concord team was flown in from the nearest hub to restart it properly. A delay measured not in hours but in shifts and cycles. Weeks without power meant weeks without full life support redundancy. Weeks the station's older residents and its youngest children might not survive comfortably, if at all, in the colder sections of the ring. Mara looked at the coolant schematic glowing on the display, tracing the lines with her eyes the way she had traced 100 smaller versions of this same problem, and for the first time in 11 years of quiet, careful, unauthorized work, she did not have time to be careful. We reroute through the secondary feed, she said, already moving. Cross the valve timing the way we do on the filtration units. Half a degree off spec, cooler running, more tolerance for exactly this kind of spike. That's not rated for reactor pressure, Mara. Nowhere close. Nothing's rated for what's happening right now. She was already at the control panel, hands finding the sequence from memory. Sam taught me the timing math years ago. I've run it on 60 units and it's never failed once. Trust me or don't, but we've got maybe 6 minutes before this makes the decision for us, and I would rather it be our decision. They trusted her. Working fast, hands steady from years of quiet practice that had never once been meant for a moment like this, Mara rerouted the coolant feed through a secondary line never designed to carry full reactor load, adjusted the valve timing using the same half-degree correction she used on ordinary filtration units, and watched the pressure curve on the display climb, hesitate at the very edge of critical, and begin, slowly, agonizingly, to fall. By the time Ozil and his assessors finally reached the control room, breathless from the run, the crisis had already passed. The reactor sat stable, well inside safe parameters, and 3 human technicians stood at the console looking exhausted and slightly stunned by what they had just done together, none of them quite ready to believe it had worked. Ozil studied the readouts for a long silent moment, his crest feathers fully raised now, a sign Mara had never seen from him before. Then he looked at her. "Explain what happened here," he said. Not an accusation, not yet. Something closer to genuine confusion. A man looking at a result his own understanding of the world had no ready place for. The core lattice failed under quota stress, Mara said, steadying her breathing. I flagged the risk 3 days ago, in the maintenance log. When the coolant feed compromised, we rerouted through the secondary line and adjusted valve timing to compensate for the load. That modification is not part of any certified procedure. No, sir. It isn't. Then how did you know it would work? Mara hesitated, glanced once, briefly, at Sam's old logs in her mind. Decades of quiet, unfiled knowledge passed from hand to hand across a lifetime she was only now beginning to fully understand. Practice, she said simply. Ozil did not respond immediately. He walked slowly around the control room, studying the rerouted coolant line with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, occasionally pausing to ask one of the junior technicians a short, precise question about a reading or a valve position. Mara watched him work and found, to her own surprise, that some small part of her wanted him to understand what he was looking at, not just record it. You flagged the structural risk 3 days ago, Ozil said finally, still studying the schematic. Through official channels. Correctly, and with appropriate caution in your language. Yes, sir. And the flag was not acted upon. Mara hesitated, unsure whether answering honestly here would help or hurt. It's a common outcome, sir. Most flags of that kind wait several weeks before a Concord engineer reviews them. This one hadn't been reviewed yet when the strut failed. Something shifted, briefly, in Ozil's expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, and for the first time since she had known him, Mara thought she saw something that might have been discomfort rather than certainty. I will need copies of every flag your maintenance team has filed in the past year, he said. Acted upon or not. Yes, sir. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, looking back at her once more. For what it is worth, Technician Ilic, Whatever this inquiry ultimately decides, you kept this station's people alive today. I do not say that lightly, and I do not intend to forget it, regardless of how the paperwork resolves. It was, Mara would think later, the closest thing to a genuine compliment Ozil Vray had ever offered a human being, and at the time, exhausted and still shaking from the 6 longest minutes of her life, she had barely registered it at all. For 6 hours, Perch 9 seemed almost grateful. Word spread through the residential ring that human technicians had saved the reactor with nothing but their own hands and a little dangerous improvisation, and there was a kind of quiet pride in the corridors that Mara had never felt directed at her people before, strangers nodding to her in the hallway, someone leaving a plate of food outside her door with no note attached. That feeling did not survive the morning. Warden Ozil Vray convened a formal inquiry, not into the reactor failure itself, but into the unauthorized modification used to resolve it. Under Concord regulation, any repair performed outside certified procedure, regardless of outcome, constituted a licensing violation. The fact that the modification had worked did not exempt it from review. If anything, Ozil explained, in his same unhurried, entirely certain tone, standing at the head of a small conference table with his hands folded behind his back, it made the review more urgent, not less. A Tier 5 contractor performing uncertified reactor-level modifications is a significant liability, he told Priya, in a meeting Mara was called to attend as a witness, seated at the far end of the table with her hands in her lap. Regardless of intent. Regardless of outcome. The question before this inquiry is not whether it worked. The question is whether it should ever have been attempted at all, by anyone, under any circumstances. It saved the station, Priya said, her voice tight but controlled. Without that modification, we would have lost power for weeks. People could have died in the cold sections. Children, elderly residents, anyone dependent on medical equipment. This time, Ozil agreed, inclining his head slightly, a gesture that might have been respect or might have simply been habit. The Concord's regulations exist because the alternative to careful procedure is not always success. Sometimes it is catastrophe, and the two can look identical right up until the final second. Your technician did not know, with certainty, that her modification would succeed. She gambled, and the gamble paid off this time. Gambling with a reactor is not a virtue we are able to license, no matter how it ends. Mara sat through the rest of the meeting mostly in silence, watching the conversation slide toward a conclusion she had feared since the moment Ozil first studied Unit 4's were patterned the day before. By the time the meeting ended, the outline of that conclusion was clear enough that nobody needed to say it outright. Perch 9's operating license would be suspended pending a full technical audit, and its human population would very likely be reassigned, dispersed across other Concord stations in small groups. The community that had grown here for 2 generations quietly dismantled in the name of proper procedure, one family at a time. That evening, Sam found Mara in the machine shop, sitting alone at the same workbench where he had first shown her the valve timing trick, years ago, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold and untouched. "They're going to break this place apart," she said, before he could speak, not looking up. "Because we fixed something. Because we were good at fixing it, better than the people who built it in the first place." "I know." Then what was the point of any of it? All those years, all those quiet fixes, all of it, and the one time it actually mattered, the one time it saved lives, it's the thing that gets us shut down. That's not justice. That's not even logic. Sam pulled the old data slate from his coat, the one holding decades of Grace Adeyemi's logs, and set it on the workbench between them, the way he had 2 nights before, its worn casing catching the low light. Maybe the mistake, he said quietly, was keeping it quiet in the first place. Maybe 70 years of staying small is exactly what taught them we had nothing worth seeing. Word of the impending shutdown had already begun moving through the residential ring by the time Mara walked home that night. The way news always moved on Perch 9, faster than any official announcement, passed door to door in low worried voices. She passed a family in the corridor loading a single suitcase with belongings, uncertain whether they would need to be ready to leave on short notice, and the sight of it settled like a stone in her chest. An older woman named Theodora, who had lived 2 doors down from Mara's family for as long as Mara could remember, stopped her in the corridor and gripped her arm, not unkindly. "Is it true," Theodora asked, "that they might split us up? Send us to different stations?" "I don't know yet," Mara said, which was honest, if not comforting. "My husband is buried here," Theodora said quietly. "In the memorial garden, deck 4. I don't want to be somewhere he isn't." She let go of Mara's arm and continued down the corridor, her suitcase already half packed at home, just in case, and Mara stood there a long moment before she could make herself keep walking. Priya requested one final meeting with Ozil before the tribunal, a quiet conversation in his temporary quarters aboard the inspectorate vessel rather than a formal proceeding. She brought no assessors, no witnesses, only herself and a folder of station records she had kept for years against exactly this kind of moment. "You have been here 11 years, Warden," she said, setting the folder down between them. "You watched this station grow from 400 people to nearly 4,000. You know these families. You know Teodora, and Deshi, and the woman who runs the hydroponics corridor. If the license is revoked, you know precisely what gets lost, not in Concord terms, but in ours. I am aware of the human cost, Director. I am not unaware of it. I simply do not have the authority to weigh it against the regulation as written. That authority sits with the tribunal, not with me." "Then tell the tribunal what you told my technician in that control room," Priya said quietly. "That she kept our people alive. Tell them that, and let them decide what to do with it, instead of deciding for them by staying silent." Ozil was quiet for a long moment, his crest feathers lying flat and still. "I intend to," he said finally. "I have never once claimed the modification was unsound, Director. Only unauthorized. I suspect, before this is finished, the tribunal will need to decide which of those two words actually matters more." The tribunal convened 3 days later, in a chamber built for Concord proceedings that had never once, in Perch 9's 11-year history, needed to be used for anything more serious than a routine license renewal. Warden Ozil Vray presided, flanked by his 2 assessors at a raised table of pale grey stone. Inspector General Thes Corin, a senior Concord official who had travelled in from a regional hub specifically for this review, sat in the observer's chair to one side, silver-scaled and unreadable, watching everything with an attention Ozil himself had never quite matched, her eyes moving constantly, missing nothing. Priya spoke first, laying out the reactor timeline plainly, without excuses, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly against the podium. Then Mara was called, and she told the truth as simply as she could, exactly as it had happened, the flag warning 3 days prior, the failed strut, the 6 minutes, the choice she had made without time to second-guess it. Ozil questioned her closely, though not unkindly, working through the timeline detail by detail, asking her to explain the valve timing correction in terms his assessors could follow. Mara answered each question plainly, without embellishment, aware the entire time that Thes Corin was watching her far more closely than Ozil was, weighing something in her silence that Mara could not read. "You performed this same modification on how many other units, before the reactor incident?" Ozil asked. 60, sir. Maybe more, going back several years." "And in that time, how many failures resulted from the modification itself, rather than from the equipment's original design?" Mara thought carefully before answering, unwilling to overstate or understate the truth in either direction. "None that I'm aware of, sir. The modified units have failed less often than the standard ones, not more." A murmur moved through the assessors at that, quickly quieted by a glance from Ozil, and Thes Corin made a small note on her own slate, the first note she had made since the proceeding began. It was Sam who spoke last, and Sam who changed the shape of the room. He did not raise his voice. He walked slowly to the front of the chamber, set the data slate on the table in front of the tribunal, and let its contents speak instead of arguing on their own behalf. "This begins 71 years ago," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet chamber, "on a Concord station called Halvern Reach, with a technician named Grace Adeyemi, who ground a valve seat half a degree off factory spec because she noticed, purely by accident, that it ran cooler that way. She taught the trick to an apprentice. That apprentice taught someone else. It spread, quietly, station to station, contractor to contractor, every time a human crew moved somewhere new, because that is how humans have always passed down what we know best. Not through filed reports and certified procedures. Through hands, and time, and repetition, and someone patient enough to show us once." He scrolled slowly through decades of entries, station names Mara had never even heard spoken aloud before this moment, dozens of them scattered across Concord space, hundreds of small unauthorized improvements stretching back farther than her own life had lasted. "We did not report it," Sam continued, "because the one time someone tried, 70 years ago, the report ended that technician's career for a full year without pay or housing. We learned instead to keep it quiet, and to let the work speak for itself, even when nobody was listening closely enough to hear it. Every filtration unit that runs longer than spec. Every coolant line that fails less often than projected. Every station that has, for decades, quietly outperformed its own maintenance schedule without anyone stopping to ask why. That has been us, all along, hiding in plain sight inside your own equipment. Kestrel leaned forward for the first time since the tribunal began, her silver scales catching the chamber's pale light. You are telling this tribunal that human contractors have been systematically outperforming certified maintenance standards across dozens of Concord facilities for 71 years, and no formal report was ever filed through proper channels. Yes, Sam said, without hesitation. Why tell us now, after all this time? What changed? Sam looked, briefly, at Mara, then at Priya, then out at the quiet chamber around them, full of faces from species he had spent a lifetime working alongside without ever fully being seen by. Because hiding it almost cost us this station, and everyone on it, he said. And because I think your index measured the wrong thing from the very beginning. It asked how long it takes us to invent something new from nothing. It never once asked how fast we learn something once we've already seen it work. 71 years of quiet logs say that second answer is the one that actually matters out here, in the tier system you built to sort us, and nobody thought to write the question down until now. The chamber was silent for a long moment, nobody stirring, nobody speaking. Kestrel studied the data slate in front of her, scrolling slowly through entry after entry, then studied Mara, then finally turned her attention to Ozil, waiting at the head table with his crest feathers held perfectly still. Warden, in your professional judgment, was the reactor modification, as performed, technically sound? Ozil was quiet for a long moment, weighing the question with the same unhurried care he weighed everything, his eyes moving once across the room before settling back on the table. Yes, he said finally. Sound, and, I will admit, more elegant in its execution than the certified procedure it replaced. I have reviewed the schematics 3 times since the incident and found no flaw in the reasoning. Then perhaps, Kestrel said, folding her hands together, the modification itself was never truly the problem before this tribunal. Perhaps the problem was that our own index left us no framework for recognizing competence when it did not arrive in a form we expected to see. The tribunal broke for deliberation, and the chamber entered slowly, humans and Concord officials alike stepping out into the corridor to wait in a silence too heavy for conversation. Mara found herself standing near the observation window, looking out at the mining core's faint blue glow, the same view she had grown up with, the same view that might, within the hour, no longer belong to her at all. Sam came to stand beside her, not speaking at first, the two of them watching the slow turn of the station together. Whatever happens in there, he said eventually, you did the thing you were trained to do. You kept people alive. Nobody can take that part away from you, whatever they decide to call it on paper. I know, Mara said. I just wish knowing that made the waiting easier. It never does, Sam said. Not once, in my whole life. You'd think it would, after enough practice. Deliberation lasted nearly 2 hours, long enough that Mara had begun composing, in her head, the conversation she would eventually have to have with Theodora, when a chime finally sounded and the chamber doors opened again, calling everyone back inside. The tribunal did not end the story with a speech. It ended it with paperwork, careful and slow and unglamorous, which was, Mara thought later, exactly the right way for a story like this one to end. Perch 9's license was reinstated within the week, its mining quota adjusted downward to match the core's actual structural limits, a change that would likely have been made eventually anyway, now simply made in time instead of after another, worse failure. Grace Adeyemi's decades of logs were formally entered into the Concord's technical record, not as evidence of violation, but as the foundation of what Kestrel's office began calling, somewhat clumsily, an applied adaptation review, a slow, ongoing reassessment of exactly what the old index had failed to measure across every Tier 5 population under Concord authority, not just humanity. Humanity's tier classification did not change overnight. Bureaucracies, Mara learned quickly, moved at their own unhurried pace regardless of what they had just been shown, regardless of how obvious the evidence sat in front of them. But for the first time in 11 years, human technicians on Perch 9 were permitted to submit repair modifications for formal certification instead of hiding them in maintenance logs worded carefully enough to slip past notice, and 3 of Mara's own valve corrections became, within a single year, standard procedure across a dozen other Concord mining stations, credited under her own name for the first time in her career. Warden Ozil Vray remained on Perch 9 as its inspector, though something in the way he spoke to Priya changed after the tribunal, a small loosening in his careful certainty, a willingness to ask a question before writing down a verdict. He never apologized outright, not in so many words. He was not, Mara suspected, built for that particular gesture, not after a lifetime inside a system that rarely required it of anyone. But he began asking questions instead of issuing conclusions, and on Perch 9, that quiet shift counted as its own kind of progress, slow and real and lasting. A year after the tribunal, Mara stood in the same machine shop where Sam had once taught her the valve timing trick, showing it now to a young Doran apprentice named Fessa, one of Ozal's own junior assessors, sent to learn the technique properly, on the record, with a certified engineer's approval stamped clean across the paperwork this time. "Half a degree," Mara said, guiding Fessa's hand along the valve seat with a patience she had learned from Sam and from Grace before him, though she had never met Grace at all, only inherited her care secondhand. "Not more. You'll feel it settle into place, like it was always meant to sit exactly there." Fessa worked slowly, carefully, the unhurried Doran way that no longer struck Mara as strange after a year of teaching, and when the seat finally clicked into its new alignment, something like pride flickered visibly across her feathered crest, unmistakable even to human eyes. "How did you learn this?" Fessa asked, turning the reworked valve over in her hands, studying it the way Mara herself once had. "Someone showed me," Mara said simply. "That's mostly how we learn anything worth knowing. Someone shows us once, carefully, and we get a little faster from there. Every single time." Fessa set the valve down carefully on the workbench, the same workbench where Grace Adeyemi had once taught a boy named Sam, where Sam had once taught a girl named Mara, where the lesson would now pass forward again into hands that had never grown up on this station at all. "On Halvern Reach," Fessa said, "there is a rumor that human technicians still keep unofficial notes. Modifications never submitted for certification. Is that true, even now?" Mara considered the question, and found she did not need to be careful with her answer anymore, not the way she once had. "Some, probably. Old habits fade slowly. But it's different now. Nobody has to hide it to keep their job. That matters more than people outside it probably realize." Sam, watching from the doorway where he had taken to observing these lessons more often than working them himself these days, said nothing, but the look on his face was one Mara had rarely seen there before, something that might have been, at long last, something close to rest. Outside the machine shop window, Perch 9 turned slowly against the dark, the same ring of grey hub modules it had always been, the same Vayrite glowed deep in the mining core below, patient and unchanged. Nothing about the station looked different from the outside, not to a passing ship, not to a stranger's eye. But somewhere in that quiet turning, a station that had once measured its people by how long it took them to invent something entirely new had finally started asking a better question, and Mara suspected the answer would keep surprising them, quietly, one valve seat at a time, for a very long time to come. And hands over the chaos behind her.